Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hi, and welcome to Reloscope, the Relationship Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm Marie Stella, your host from Melbourne, Australia. Let's start the show. Hello and welcome back to Reloscope, the Relationship Science Insights podcast. Now, in a world where simple swiping and matching have become the norm, the dynamics of sexual health and well-being have taken on new dimensions and become vital to discuss more now than ever. So today we're exploring the nuances of consent and boundaries, as well as embracing sexual empowerment and self-care, all while acknowledging that dating apps offer both opportunities and challenges in these connections. And to guide us through this conversation is anthropologist, author, and activist Treena Orchard. Fascinated by digital technology and relationships of all kinds, Dr. Orchard also writes about dating apps and her own swiping experiences. But that aside, she serves as associate professor at Western University School of Health Studies. Hi, Treena. It's a delight to have you on the show.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for joining us as well. And I'm really curious to know, and I'm sure our viewers are as well, could you give us a small glimpse into what your swiping experience has been like so far?
Sure. A small glimpse is kind of challenging because my book came out yesterday. It's called Sticky, Sexy, Sad, Swipe Culture and the Darker Side of Dating Apps. And it's about 254 pages. So if you want the whole story of the last 7 years off and on, check it out. Mm-hmm. But in terms of an overview, I was motivated to write the book because I had been single for a while, relatively newly sober, wanting to get back into the dating game and felt compelled to try dating apps. It seemed to be the only choice. And I'm a Luddite. So I just got my first car at the age of 49. So very sort of backwards Fred Flintstone kind of person. So I was quite nervous and anxious about the dating app situation. And I really fell head first, feet first, tumbling into the digital rabbit hole that is dating apps. And they really brought me to my knees. I learned a lot. I struggled a lot. I learned about myself. I learned about dating, relationships, sexuality, masculinity, feminism. I began swiping in 2017, so at the beginning of the Me Too movement. So that really had a big impact on my experiences as well. And looking at the market, there really wasn't a book that combined anthropological insights as well as the lived experience of a woman in her 40s and 50s, sex-positive feminist. And I was also looking for a creative challenge. I had been at my job for 14, 15 years and wanted to do something a bit more exclusively creative. And that's why it's a memoir and not a research study-based book.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And first of all, you're 49 because that's unbelievable.
I'm actually 51.
You're 51. No way.
1972, baby.
You look like well under 40. So that's a big shock for me. But second of all, I have to agree as someone who did swipe for a while. I think I was on the apps for about 2 years or a bit more than that, kind of on and off. And I've heard a lot of negative reviews about dating apps in general from friends, but I always kind of disagree and would urge people to try going on dating apps for a bit longer if they are still on the dating market, just because even if it's not that you find a long-term partner, you learn a lot about yourself and what you want in a relationship as well. So this is all a great introduction for our topic for the day. But before we get further into detail, we love to get to know you better. This is Have You Met Treena Orchard? And my first question for you is, what do you like to do in your spare time?
In my spare time, well, if it's the summertime in Canada, I'm in my garden. I have a huge backyard. It's about 70 feet long. And so I love to garden. I love to, sort of nerd things like read, go to movies, spend time with my cats. They are my world. Yes. So I have two cats. I have an orange, a large orange. I mean, I'm sure you're curious, as will the viewers be, because so many of us love cats. I have a large orange cat, and her name is Elliot. And then I have a little slinky black and white guy, and his name is Jonah.
Yeah, we have a huge cat enthusiast community here in the office as well. Is your Ginger a male?
No, she's a female, which is rare.
Yeah, rare.
Yeah. So beyond that, I travel. My family all lives like thousands of miles away. Canada's a big country. So I travel home 3 or 4 times a year, as well as travel for conferences, and usually try to extend a conference so that, it's a little bit of a mini vacay. Yeah.
So what have been some of your favorite spots that you visited so far?
The favorite spots, sort of like around the world, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, I love New Mexico and Sicily. I love New Mexico and I love Sicily. They're both very different places. They're both places that have been famous in the art scene. I'm a huge art fanatic. A lot of the trips I take are sort of pilgrimages to the birthplaces or sometimes the resting places of different artists, poets, painters, writers. I recently was in Mexico, for instance, at a writers' conference, and then I spent a few days in Mexico City and made sure to visit Frida Kahlo's house. I've got a couple tattoos of her on me, so it was a real sort of like a homecoming, as it were. And I love St. Petersburg, Russia. I love Florence, Italy, of course. Everyone loves Florence. How could you not? Yeah, like New York City is the place as well. I love New York. LA is cool. So I lived in India doing my PhD research, so I spent a lot of time there, Cambodia and Vietnam. Yeah, there's lots of places I really enjoy.
I was really expecting maybe a couple of places, and you gave me a couple, and I was like, oh, okay. And then it just came gushing in. But I totally understand. I feel like every single place that you visit just has something so unique to offer that it's really hard to just say, like, this is my favorite spot of all time because of this one reason, because everywhere else just has their own things to offer. And you did mention previously that you love reading books during your spare time. So what are some that you're reading at the moment?
I'm reading a couple of books by Canadian author Sheila Heti. She's a really amazing author. And I'm also listening to an audiobook by Melissa Broder. She's an American poet, essayist, and novelist. And she's so inspiring and kind of weird and wonderful. I really, really like her work. I read a lot of memoir, but I do like fiction as well, for sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what would you say you like about her writing?
What I like about Melissa's writing is it's inventive. It weaves in sort of fantastical, obscure, often hilarious, self-depreciating observations about people, things that we think to ourselves, but we don't usually share with someone unless it's a very close friend and it's a safe space. But when you say these kind of weird things, and many writers will say this, they'll like put in the weird details because that's what we all think about, but we don't always give ourselves license to write it down. And it's like, oh my God, I love that she sees that too, and she's sexually open. And I love her voice as well. It has like a slight Valley Girl tinge to it. So it's like really cool. It's like, girl, I will read and listen to everything you do. So, yeah.
I love that. It's also what makes a writer feel vulnerable and relatable as well, in order
yeah, in order to feel that connection with a writer, they really have to pull you in with these weird tiny details, and it's what makes it so interesting. So that sounds like a really great writer to have in your repertoire of books. So my last question for you before we end off the heavy med section is, who do you look up to the most in your life?
In my life. Wow. Yeah, well, I would say my mom is one person that I look up to. We've both struggled with addictions in our life. As she got sober 2 years before I did. I got sober in 2012. It was challenging growing up in a household like that, but she's overcome a lot of things in her life. So she's one person I look up to. I also look up to my stepmom, who was a lawyer. She's been a freelance writer, photographer. She's done a lot of different jobs, traveled all over the world, continues to travel by herself with her friends at the age of 75. She has a really adventurous look to life, and then there are, famous people that I look up to as well, but, mainly writers and artists and activists.
Yeah, that is so sweet. And I feel like moms are really the pillars of society in some way.
What don't they do? What don't
Yeah,
they do?
exactly.
Yeah.
Like most moms that I know are just doing everything and so quietly as well. Not going like, I do this and this and this and this, but they're so quietly
Right.
in the background, holding up the family, holding up the house, while everyone is off on their own, pursuing their career and their hobbies and everything, and they just hold down the fort while pursuing their own interests. And it's like, how do you even do that? Because I am actually failing at life administration at the moment. It's like, actually, how did you do that so well and so silently for so long? So they seem like really, really great role models to look up to, and it's fantastic that you have them in your life. Now that we've gotten to know you a bit better, we'll move on to the interview section. And my first question for you is, what is a relationship to you? How would you describe a relationship?
Yeah, well, I guess I would begin with a classic statement that there is no singular kind of relationship. Relationships, there's a garden variety of them, but fundamentally it's about connection of some sort, whether it's through blood, whether it's through social location, whether it's through shared interests. And there's some sort of mutual investment in one another. And it's not only about the relationship between two people, it can extend beyond two people. But if we're talking about intimate relationships, traditionally, we think of an intimate relationship as being between two people, whatever gender you can imagine. But we also know that there are different romantic as well as familial setups that involve more than one or two couples. And so relationships in general have become very elastic, dynamic, and fluid over the past, well, I'd say centuries, frankly, but in particular, the last few years, as different kinds of categories have emerged to define intimacy, relationships. And there's also a movement, I think, against relationships. A lot of young people I know are like, relationships, no, we're just talking. And I'm like, well, you seem to be doing everything that I would imagine is a relationship. Oh, no. But they resist the term relationship because they're afraid. And they see around them that people hurt each other when they're in relationships often. But also, this is something I found interesting, is that they said, relationship as we conceive of it traditionally is something that they have imported from earlier generations. It's not necessarily something that is local and organic from them. And so that's another reason that they resist relationships. So relationships are in an interesting moment.
Yeah, it is a huge trend right now, like the talking stage and the what do they call it? It's the um what do they call it? Oh, situationship.
Yes.
The
Yes.
situationships are a
Yeah.
huge thing right now. How do you think dating apps has changed this whole the whole landscape of relationships?
Yeah, small question. I think that they have had a huge impact on the pushback against relationships in a way, because they're designed to keep us swiping. They give us intermittent wins, right? When you just first join an app, just speaking about my experience, it's like, ooh, new girl in town and get all the hot people right away. Whether or not they're real, who knows? You find out, right? But, and then different points, Thanksgiving is a big swiping weekend here in North America. Christmas time also. And you get different directives from the apps, and they're encouraging you, get out there, keep swiping, stay swiping. So that very normalized message about constant action, constant movement is the exact opposite of the dominant narrative we hear about relationships traditionally, which is choose one person and settle down. Well, if we all did that, we wouldn't be on dating apps very long, right? And they want us to search and search and search and search. And that really creates a divide between traditional ideas about 2x2 in terms of a relationship and what is sort of the constant search that is promoted on dating apps. And so if people are constantly searching, they're not giving each person they're connecting with all that much time or energy, right? So it's not super meaningful. And they're not really making decisions about not even necessarily settling down, but selecting one person at one point in time. And then add into that ghosting situations and people disappearing off the face of the platform. And even if you were in a relationship, well, you're not anymore. So there's so many ways that dating apps feed into the fluidity and the instability that we see now characterizing relationships.
Yeah, I noticed that from my time swiping on dating apps as well, that dating apps give you this illusion almost of a luxury of choice, where you're presented with so many of these people that are nearby you who are single and ready to mingle, and all you have to do is match with them, and you that's a potential partner in your life, or that's someone that you're potentially dating. But the reality is that there is a lot of, well, I wouldn't want to call it ghosting, just because I feel like matching with someone and not talking to them isn't really ghosting. But there is a lot of just empty conversations, and things just don't really happen because people have lives. And it gives you this false perception that you have a lot of choices that you can pick from. But is that the experience that you had as well?
Yeah, well, I think you do have a lot of choice, but the choices don't mean very much because nothing lasts.
Yeah.
So I think you do have a lot of choice. But that's one of the things that is so laborious about dating apps, is that you're constantly rearranging your priorities, looking at the people you currently have, comparing them to the ones out there, debating whether or not you're going to, talk to, person number 3 down here, or maybe somebody new will come up here. So you're wasting, in my mind, you're wasting so much valuable energy on this itemization and sort of the hierarchy of needs and where you're at in every moment. It just disperses your romantic energy, and it doesn't really leave you with a lot at the end of the day. That doesn't mean that that is the only kind of experience on dating apps, but I know that that is a dominant experience. I stopped swiping when I was in some meaningful relationships, people I connected with on dating apps. So I certainly have found love. But dating apps didn't teach me about love. They don't teach you about dating. They don't really teach you anything. All they do is connect you. We do the work of dating and, love and all that kind of thing, and sex and other kind of, community. But but I think in general, ghosting happens a lot. It happened a lot to me. So I think, catfishing and a lot of other swindling, and there's a lot of other negative, certain kinds of violence, racial fetishization, yada, yada,
And how do you think dating apps has affected the dynamics of sexual intimacy and health awareness?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that, one of the things I talk about in chapter 2 of my book, that chapter is called Sex and Swipedom, that I was just puzzled by how difficult it was to meet someone and actually have sex. And girls out here to date in real life, but it seemed like people were afraid to meet in real life. Back in the day, like when I grew up, there was no phone and you met in real life. That was like the first situation. Now, most of the interactions you have on dating apps remain in the phone, right? They don't even make it to the flash. And as someone who wanted to meet in real life, I know that there's a whole interesting thing that can happen with people just sexting and, the fantasy piece and just being digital. That's cool, but that's not what I wanted. So I found that dating apps made us almost more anxious about meeting in real life, having sex. There's also the world is changing in terms of gender and power dynamics, right? And that creates a sense of instability. And a number of men I spoke with were like, well, I'm afraid to be too forward, or, somebody will say I'm being aggressive, or, they'll, but yet sometimes they're very aggressive still as well. So it can be a lot to sort of wade through. But I found that they can kind of create more distance between us as opposed to bringing us together, which I thought was like ironic.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think needs to happen in order for us to be brought together? What kind of conversations do you think we should be having?
Oh, we should be having, well, first of all, we need to have sex ed everywhere from a very young age. It needs to be tailored for social location, different communities, different needs. It needs to be inclusive. It needs to be trauma informed. It needs to be attentive to the world as it is changing around us. And it also needs to not be just focused on risks and dangers, which is very traditional in like public health sort of situations. And a lot of sex ed, don't do this, don't do that. Boys over here, girls over here. We'll talk about reproduction and then, we're done with it. That is not good enough. That is dangerous. And it leaves so many people at risk and doesn't make them feel comfortable to explore who they are, let alone try and understand how to move through different kinds of relationships, communication in general, consent, safety, pleasure. We learn these things in a very haphazard way. We learn them through friends, celebrities, which is not really always the best source of information. Gwyneth, okay, you're not a medical expert. Like, just come on, okay? So sex ed is a huge piece, and we need to have a much more robust sexual dialogue about people's actual lives, actual bodies, actual desires, fears, challenges, also joys. If we lived in places where those kinds of things were the standard fare, we would see a reduction in so many different kinds of violence and people feeling less alone and people feeling more in touch with who they are, which is win-win in every way possible.
And what are some of the biggest misconceptions about sexual intimacy and health that you think can be incorporated or addressed in sex education?
Oh, that's a really huge question. I think just understanding things like gender, it's not a binary, and learning how to talk about that in a way that doesn't make people feel nervous and angry and afraid. Because lots of the violence we see is, it comes from fear, right? Not necessarily hatred, but it comes out as though it's hatred. And so I think, discussions about gender, discussions about pleasure, safety, also unlearning a lot of the stuff that we have all inherited with respect to men are like this, women are like this, this kind of thing. Patriarchy serves very, very few of us, and it does almost as much harm to a lot of men as it does to other people. And so unlearning some of those problematic things about power, what is weakness, what is softness, emotions are just for certain people. Emotions, they're just, for women, or they're, a sign of being frail, or, looking at vulnerability as a weakness. And frankly, it's not, right? And so conversations like this, and using real examples from life as a way to illustrate and apply different techniques of communication, right? The way we speak to one another is so, so important. And we don't often grow up learning how to do it in a way that feels safe and fun and inclusive.
Yeah, for sure. And for a lot of the people who have already graduated from high school and are already on dating apps and haven't gotten that sufficient sexual health, what do you think is the best route for them to increase or support their awareness for this?
Well, I think a lot of communities, even though we don't have great sex ed across the world, or, it's really piecemeal, I think that we do have usually a lot of us, different cities and even towns have trusted, resources, whether it's people, whether it's a library, whether it's, one teacher at the school. There might be a way to sort of partner with people who are trusted, who are adults, who are already kind of doing this work, and think about a way to kind of scale it up, that's going to be of interest to different populations. And I think of interest to different populations, and also, if possible, include, whether it's parents or people in the workplace, because our sexuality, our identity, communication is important, not just in our intimate experiences, but it really does bleed into our workplaces as well, positively and negatively. And I think if we begin talking about these things in multiple spheres, it will just work to normalize it, and normalize it a lot quicker than if we just sort of silo it off and like, oh, that's what we learn from, 15 to 18, and this is 12 and under, and things like that.
Hmm. And do you think there's a need for dating apps to incorporate anything about sexual health awareness, or to incorporate maybe features or attributes about their apps that highlight this?
Yeah, and I think it's something that most dating apps do a very poor job of. Most of us are probably familiar with Grindr, and you're required to show your HIV status and when you last got tested. That's one way of doing it, and that's quite unique to the gay or MSM, different kinds of men communities, men who have sex with men, male identifying populations. But on most of the other standard dating apps like Bumble and Tinder, those are the ones I use the most. There was no requirement in terms of putting up your vaccine status or your STI status, certainly, or whether you identify as sex positive or you're sort of conservative sexually. I mean, we can use our profile space to include those things, right? But, as someone who has been swiping off and on for years, very few people do. Although towards, the most recent experience I had with swiping, I was seeing much more, I'm in a poly situation, or, couples looking to play. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're communicating about sexual health, sexual preferences, relationship dynamics. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of that. But I think it would be interesting to explore, with different communities and have user feedback, and then, share those findings with the different app creators, because you could certainly be, you can sort of shift some of the way that the platforms are set up to make room for that. And I think that would be quite helpful, especially stuff about sexual violence, because there's lots of overlap between dating as it emerges on dating apps and porn. The rise of, choking. We're hearing lots of stories about that has become so normalized in different kinds of situations, and extremely dangerous if not done correctly. And like, where does this come from, right? So things like that.
Yeah, that sounds like it would be incredibly helpful. And I was just thinking about a very extreme idea of it, and it sounds almost dystopian, but I feel like anything extreme would sound dystopian. I'm kind of going off topic a little bit, but it just, if in an extreme event, it does sound like it is very, very like in a dystopian way, just categorizing people into these very specific boxes. But at the same time, for the purposes of a dating app to help people find the right people for each other, in a setting where they have all these preferences, it sounds like it would help speed the process up a little bit, and also cut out a lot of the back and forth and waiting and empty conversations. And yeah.
It could, if people are truthful, but people are not always truthful on dating apps. People can be, that's one of the things I was learning over and over again. I was like, profile, real life. There is a big disconnect. So there's also that. But, perhaps there would be a way to build in, when you give your responses, they have to be verified, right?
Yeah, that's so true. But what kind of challenges do you foresee in trying to integrate these features into dating apps?
I think, the issue of privacy. Sexual health is seen, and it is, it's a sexual, or it's a private aspect of who we are. And yes, a lot of people on dating apps want to date, but I think that some people might resist that because it just feels like that's really not information that I want to share publicly, offline, or, once a match is made, then users can perhaps exchange that information themselves. But in terms of advertising it on their public profile, I can see a lot of people pushing back because of that. And also concerns about being judged, because we are still a very moralistic kind of society. And we talk a lot about diversity and everything is shifting and things like that. But when you get down to it, a lot of people are very judgmental still. And so that might be another reason why people are like, I'm not sure if I want to say all of that.
Yeah. So all in all, what do you hope to see in the future of sexual health and well-being in dating apps?
Well, I think what we need to see is we need to see discussions about it, because it's virtually absent. We see a little bit about consent. We see a little bit about dick pics. Okay, that's something. But, the bread and butter of most of our experiences can really shade into coercion and violence and discomfort very, very quickly. And sometimes, you're like, how did I get here? I answered a few questions, but, the force of someone's, intention or motivation, or the scripts that they have inherited from porn, dominant, far right people who think that, feminists are terrible and that women are just objects, etc. That can happen really, really quickly. And so finding a way to either, exit that conversation safely and without that other person having any information to follow them or find them, that's important. And also just maybe, when people are signing up, have interesting, engaging information about it, and make sure that is part of the conversation going forward in all the marketing and promo. So it's not just about dating, but that it's sort of dating is in this broader ecology about consent, about sexual health, and about pleasure, right? Because often when we think sexual health, people are like, ooh, those negative things, those diseases. But part of sexual health involves pleasure, people. And so a way to just make that sexier.
Yeah, and some STIs can be cured as well. There are cures for them. So the idea that STIs, like you're basically dead with an STI is just it's just such a misconception. Like
last century. Yeah, no. Yeah.
But yeah, thank you for answering my questions. I feel like I learned a lot from you and we had a really good conversation about it. Now I want to ask you a bit more about the practical sides of things. And the first question I want to ask is, what is a habit that you practice to manage your sexual health and well-being when swiping on dating apps?
Well, I went through a few different strategies. I'm not currently swiping. I haven't swiped for a little while because I just ended a very significant relationship. But certainly when I was swiping, one of the things I tried to do was to have key times when I would swipe. At the very beginning, I was swiping all day long and I was just completely consumed and obsessed. And oh my God, that took so much energy out of me. Then I began to sort of schedule my times. And so I felt like I had more control over the experience. And that helped a lot because people are not on their best on dating apps. And it can be very laborious, emotionally, psychologically. But if you kind of schedule it, it feels a bit more contained. Something else I do is morning meditations. I just began doing that. And I just use the Insight Timer app. It's really great, very reasonable, has loads of resources, lots of cool teachers, different courses. So those are certainly things. And also try to be as reflexive as possible as I'm moving through different kinds of experiences. Your gut is always right. And if you feel a bit apprehensive about someone, or if they start to profess, feelings of deep intimacy and love. It's like, it's day 2, friends. You don't even know me. Chances are you're correct that something's a bit fishy. I would also quite regularly, I would call people out on their bad behavior. Not every time, or else that's all I would be doing. But there were moments when, I'd say something and they'd just be like, oh, send me these kind of pictures. Hey. And I'd be like, no, I've already said no to that. And then they'd, the same thing again. I said, why are you talking to me like this? And about half the time they'd be like, ooh, you can't take a joke. And it's like unmatched. But then the other half, and I was pretty surprised that it was about 50% would be like, you're right, my bad. And so sometimes because we JPEG each other, we reduce each other to objects when we're swiping at such a volume that we swipe at. Sometimes just finding moments to disrupt the normative bullshit that often happens, right? And then there can be a click. Does it mean that person's going to go off and treat everyone with like, oh, respect? No. But, at this point in time, I'm worried about like me, right? And I want to be treated with respect, right? Doesn't mean we can't be sexy about stuff, but just like, let's be respectful, right?
Yeah.
So those are some practices.
Yeah. I've also found that calling people out on their bad behavior, even if it's on dating apps where they're basically strangers, does help a lot with potentially just that awareness as well, like supporting that awareness for it, because people don't do that enough, and then so they keep perpetuating the same behaviors, and if you are the first one to call them out on it, it makes for a very memorable experience, and chances are, well, I'm not sure. I didn't do research on this, so I don't know what the findings are. But I like to personally believe that it's memorable enough that they don't do it again to someone else. Or if they do it at a much, much lower level, to a much lower extent. And what you were saying before about having specific times to swipe on dating apps because otherwise it would consume you is so accurate. I feel like I've always said this to my friends that dating is basically a part-time job, right? Because you are after work, you are in bed and you're just swiping for hours and you're replying to people. It is a part-time job and it's constant
an unpaid part-time job.
It is an unpaid part-time job. You actually have to pay for this part-time job. Because you go on the date and then you have to pay. And the other thing about what you said before, actually, during the interview section, the main interview, about coercion and needing to discuss these things is so important as well, because I noticed that I insist on paying for myself for at least the first 3 dates because I'm so afraid that this person will think that just because they've paid for my meal, they can coerce me to do something or they expect me to do something now. And that shouldn't be how I'm feeling. That really shouldn't.
Yeah. But you know what? You stake your boundaries. And if the individual has a problem with that, it's like, well, this is who I am.
Yeah, absolutely. So those are really, really great habits to practice. Are there any challenges when doing any of these? Like, do you ever feel the need to check on your dating app throughout the day? How do you remind yourself not to do that?
Well, I think the more you sort of do it in a scheduled format, then it becomes a habit. That doesn't mean that it's never in your mind when you're not in your scheduled times. Of course it is, especially if you really want to find someone. And, that's one of the reasons why dating apps really did bring me to my knees. I've had people laugh at me when I say that. And it's like, I live in kind of a small city where unless you're a student or an elderly person or a person with a family, I am none of those. 51 is not elderly. There are very few opportunities to find some pretty cool people. And so I had waited a long time before swiping. I've done a lot of personal healing. I am ready, And so it felt like it really mattered when I kept running into challenges or people would vanish after I thought we had something meaningful. So it really impacted me in a lot of ways, and so even though I learned to sort of schedule, it was still a challenge, I will be honest. But another thing that is, I think, really important is to sort of expand our dating ecologies, not be so swipe dependent. Try and think of other ways to create opportunities to meet people in the wild. And so when you're not so dependent on one technique, it loosens things up a bit, and it also opens doors. The universe does listen to us. The universe does present us things, right? And have the courage to follow through and take a risk.
Yeah. Well, to your first point, I'm really sorry that people were laughing at you for that. I can totally see why dating apps would bring you to your knees as someone who was swiping for years. It is tough out there, and you have to do so much self-reflection, so much introspection, to the point where you're like, is this too much introspection? I'm with you, Treena. And I see how it could have brought you to your knees. And to your second point, have you tried finding people in the wild?
It's hard. Yeah. It's hard. I haven't done it yet because I only ended my last relationship about a month and a half ago. But I think, just sort of shifting from a partnered to a single mind space and sort of going into the world in an open way, sensually, sexually. It's really interesting, the kind of energy that you can attract. I mean, I've certainly flirted with people and sort of been interested in them, but I also know that I'm starting my book tour and I am going to be gone for so much of the summer. My book is my significant relationship at this point. And I need to also do a bit of reflection about the last relationship that has just sort of come to an end, and think about, what did I learn? What do I want to do differently? And how do I want to do it? In the city where I live, it's kind of hard. I go to yoga a lot, but I don't really want to, if I did meet someone at the studio, there's quite a few nice looking people, let me tell you. But I've been a bit wary about making a move, because if things were weird, then it's that space is so valuable to me. There's so few beacons of cultural meaning in the city. I don't want to mess it up. So I've just been kind of cautious,
Well, that's good for you. It sounds like you're healing at a really healthy rate. I am absolutely the same way with the places that I frequent. Sometimes I would spot someone that I might be very, very casually interested in, maybe flirt with them a little bit, but, you really want to retain that safe space, and you really do want to actually continue frequenting there. So it's sometimes a bit of a oh, do I do this or do I not? But maybe we'll hear from you again sometime down the line when you've tried it for yourself, and we'll hear about your experiences too. Now we're moving on to the open mic, and this is your opportunity to talk about anything that you're passionate about. It doesn't have to be related to the topic, but it can be, absolutely. So if you want to talk about your book, feel free to go ahead. The floor is yours.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would love to talk about my book. First of all, the cover. The cover is so beautiful. It is, when designing a cover, I sent a few ideas to the publisher. And the one that was most alluring to them was, something botanical and lush, but also something that had a few prickles in it. And the artist who did the design, this flower is called the Night Queen, and it grows out of a cactus. So it's this beautiful, lush flower, but then there are prickly bits of the cactus. And that really ties into the title, Sticky, Sexy, Sad, which in many ways sums up the spectrum of my experiences on dating apps. And it's a very alluring, cover. And so that's going to help sell. We often look at the cover of a book, and the title it's unique, and I think will hopefully draw people in. And it was just released yesterday, which is really exciting. And it's the product of 7 years. I began swiping in 2017. I haven't swiped consistently for 7 years, but I first began in 2017. And it's a big shift from writing as an academic to writing in a more creative way. And also having the courage to write openly about really intimate things I've encountered, as well as reflections on my past and trauma and addictions. I think these are stories that a lot of people relate to. And they do tie into how we learn about intimacy and relationships, whether it's positive or negative. Most of us adapt in a few different ways, and we use strategies that we kind of limp around and carry from our past. And they don't always serve us for the whole, going forward. So it's like, how do we reconfigure ourselves in these new landscapes? And I document that, so it's kind of like there are a few different stories going on. Certainly dating apps, how you use them, what they're like, what are some of the social impacts they're having on our lives. But then sort of parallel to that is my journey as a healing woman. And so I think it will appeal to, I'm hoping, not just women my own age, but also younger people. Men are another demographic that I thought about a lot because I'm primarily hetero. And I was looking to date and understand men primarily. And I also asked a lot of them about their swiping experiences. And they don't really have it any easier. And so working their experiences into the book in a respectful, realistic, sort of, honest way is important. And a few of my, previous lovers, they've read different segments of the book and they're like, oh man, men need this book because we don't know about women and we don't really know how they experience apps. And it was interesting to them. And so it was also, my storytelling was effective and really resonate with men as well as women. So that's really exciting.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It sounds like a fantastic book. I just might pick one up myself at some point. And
Yes.
congratulations for finishing it and launching it. It's an
Thank you.
incredible, huge feat, both professionally and personally. It
Yeah.
must have been such a challenge as well. What were the biggest challenges that you faced?
The biggest challenge was making the decision that it's not going to be an academic study, that it's going to be a memoir. And if you want a book to sell well, you have to have a good book deal. And because I'm unknown in like the more trade publishing world, I need a literary agent. And there are very few literary agents in North America. And when you don't already have a popular book behind you, I have academic books and academic writing. But so building that public platform and making myself attractive enough for literary agents who then help me get a good book deal. That was extremely arduous. It was like learning a new language off the side of my desk. It was like having another part-time job. Learning about the trade publishing industry was challenging. It was also very fascinating. So that was probably the biggest challenge.
Yeah. That does sound like a very arduous process to go through. I myself am not very good at marketing myself personally. So it does sound like a very intense process. And so congratulations to you once again for launching the book. If our listeners want to find the book, where can they go?
Well, I'm not sure if it's yet available in Australia, but it's certainly on Audible, the audio version. They can check Amazon, Indigo. The University of Toronto Press is the publisher, but I'm not sure if it's quite available internationally. Certainly within Canada, it is, but just Google Sticky Sexy Sad and my name and see what happens.
Amazing. We'll link them in the show notes. Apart from that, thank you, Treena, for joining us today. If our listeners want to find out more about you and what you do, where can they go?
Well, the first place they can go to is my website, which is treenaorchard.com. And then because I'm an old person, Instagram is the place where I am primarily on social media. And that's just my first and last name. And I also am on LinkedIn. Also, my first and last name, Treena Orchard. I'm on Facebook. Don't judge. First and last name. I'm on X. I don't even know why, but on X, I'm Sticky Sexy Sad. And I also have a little newsletter on Substack, which you can join for free and see my more creative writing. I do a story every 7 to 10 days. That's a really fun platform for creatives as well.
Amazing. We'll link those in the show notes as well. Thank you everyone for tuning in. We hope you learned a bit about sexual health awareness, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
You've been listening to Reloscope, the Relationship Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. For more episodes like this from 10 different life management perspectives, search LMSL on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts, so you can get updated on everything we have to offer. We have a wide range of topics readily available for you to check out. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps us grow and bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at re.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Marie Stella. Thanks for tuning in.